The UK government has announced it is to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Mauritius has claimed sovereignty over the islands in the Indian Ocean, which are around 500 km south of the Maldives. Since independence in 1968, the UK evicted its population of more than 1,000 people to make way for a U.S. military base. The dispute continued at the United Nations and in international courts for many years. Well, with me is our correspondent, Andrew Harding, one of the few people who've been to the Chagos Islands. This is a long-running story. Take us through this momentous decision today.
It's an extraordinary story, as you say. It's been in the courts for a long time. It's one of those disputes that has sort of rumbled on in the background. Most people listening to this, watching this, will never have heard of the Chagos Islands, but they might have heard of Diego Garcia, and that's the island, the American military base, that is really at the heart of the dispute and at the heart of this breakthrough today. And that's how both the Mauritian government and the British government are framing this. It's about security long-term in the Indian Ocean. So basically, in 1968, back when Mauritius won its independence, it didn't get full independence because Britain kept back the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius. It had already promised in a secret deal to give the Diego Garcia atoll to the Americans for a military base, and since then in the background the Mauritians would be campaigning to get those islands back, to have full sovereignty, full independence if you like, and the UN has already taken that very seriously in recent years. Though, as Britain has for instance embarked on Brexit, it's begun to lose international support. The African continent as a whole has really come together as well to campaign on this issue of anti-colonialism, to say Britain must end its last occupation of this last piece of its old empire in Africa, and that has, I think, galvanized a lot of international support. And finally, today we have what both sides agree really is a historic moment. They've signed a deal. They still need to sign a treaty. But they basically done a deal on all the details, and if they put it in this very short announcement today, key is the fate of Diego Garcia, which the Americans will continue to operate from now for the next 99 years, whereas the British lease that they'd granted the Americans was running out in the next decade. Key also is the fate of the Chians, those 1,000 people you mentioned who've been forcibly deported from the islands back in the 60s and 70s. They will also now have the right to return there for the first time, and the Mauritian government will look into that and the viability of them living there. And thirdly and finally, I think this is fundamentally about this issue of international law, and Britain could sense that it was losing the room, it was losing support at the US or these international bodies, and so under some pressure it has come to this extraordinary moment.
So essentially this comes on the back of years of increasing international pressure, notably this ruling by the international, the ICJ, and it just got to the point, did it, where it became untenable that Britain held sovereignty over these islands.
Exactly, the ICJ ruled unanimously that Britain was not in charge, had never been lawfully the owner, the sovereign of these islands, and was putting more pressure on the British government now. For years Britain has said, actually, you've got your history wrong. Mauritius, you never had the right to these islands. History shows this has been in continual British occupation since the 19th century, but Mauritius has always disputed that, and in recent years the British government, successive British governments, have started to acknowledge that, saying, look, once these islands are no longer needed for security purposes, in other words, once the Americans don't need that base anymore, we will hand them over to Mauritius. In a sense, they'd already acknowledged that Mauritius had a claim, and now they have honored that agreement, if you like.
You've been there, what is there on these islands?
They're stunning. These are tropical atolls, the sort of thing that you read about in almost like a fairy tale. Beautiful marine protected zone. They are almost exclusively now uninhabited. A few yachtsmen occasionally pitch up on one of them. There, scattered there, you can't sail quickly between them. They are far from anywhere else except for Diego Garcia, which is the one island that has all sorts of very secretive American military installations, a very small British presence there as well, but fundamentally, a big American base for its bombers, its submarines, its navy refueling, rearming, very, very important part of the American military projection in the Indian Ocean.
And to be clear that will stay, even though sovereignty has now changed, gone back to.
Exactly, and had the Americans said, you know what, we prefer to stick with the British, this deal would not have been done. They have agreed, with a lot of help from negotiators over some time, that they can get a deal with the Mayan government that satisfies America's long-term strategic interests in a part of the world where, of course, China, India, there's a lot of competition and, potentially in the future, a lot of contestation.
You mentioned the people, the 1,000 people who were essentially evicted from their wood. We now expect those people to move back. Are these uninhabited islands now likely to become inhabited?
Possibly, but they will be very hard to support there. It's a long way from anywhere. It would be a huge investment by the Mayan government to turn these remote islands into habitable places, certainly beyond Diego G here. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and there's a lot of difference of opinion between the Chians and the people who have come now to live in Britain or Mauritius or the cells. They have different attitudes towards what they believe should be the future of these islands.
Just looking at some of the reaction and statements, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy, just to read you what he said. This government inherited a situation where the long-term secure operation of the Diego Garcia military base was under threat, with contested sovereignty and ongoing legal challenges. Today's agreement secures this vital military base for the future. It will strengthen our role in safeguarding global security, shut down any possibility of the Indian Ocean being used as a dangerous illegal migration route to the UK, as well as guaranteeing our long-term relationship with Mauritius, a close Commonwealth partner. That statement just shows the level of complexity and why these small, uninhabited islands thousands of miles away have been so important.
Complexity, but the focus there on the security. But really, yes, this is one of these what look like on the face of it tiny disputes between two friendly countries, Britain and Mauritius. Very close cooperation, very good relations, and yet it shows how the international system at large works and is evolving. Britain more isolated than it was when it was in the EU, increasingly aware that it needs support when it comes to Ukraine. It needs supports from African countries in a much more multi-polar world. The old Cold War rules, where you divide up the world and the big powers basically look the other way. That era is ending, and Britain is finding itself more isolated and being forced to cut this kind of deal in order to protect its interests, its credibility, in particular at big institutions where Britain finds itself, for instance, on the ICJ, with no longer a serving judge there. Thanks for watching this video.